Шановні колеги, ми
Dear colleagues, we continue working day in the Ukrainian Crisis Media Center, and our topic now is start of civil advocacy campaign to support bill on tax on exported capital instead of income tax as a basic part of fiscal reform. We have Oleksandr Semyatkin from Kyiv Business School, Oleksandr Sokolovskyi, entrepreneur, Oleksandr Sokolovskyi, businessman, president of all-Ukrainian Union of Light Industry Employers, and Eduard Kurganskyi, businessman, representative of the Association of Small and Medium Business NGOs in Ukraine. Oleksandr will speak the first. Good morning, dear colleagues. Today's our briefing is devoted to the reform which could happen in Ukraine if there are enough political will, enough strength among experts and in society. Quite often we observe just superficial changes in taxes while we need profound reform. And now we have made a radical suggestion to substitute the income tax with a tax on withdrawn capital. What does it mean for business? If you look at the existing system in Ukraine, we clearly observe that corruption and taxes are very close to each other, and any officer from the state fiscal service are associated quite often with corruption. As of today, what we call the tax on income, the income tax, is actually not a tax. As of today, all the collections of income tax, they depend on the wishes of the state to get revenues to the budget, and usually the figure of revenues is designed by the government, and it is made as a target for the officials from state fiscal service, while today's society lives in 2016. But for businesses, it means that any inspection may come to inspect the year 2013, 2014, and decide that any business should pay additional taxes. The tax on withdrawn capital would mean that the tax part of tax will remain in business, which would allow to create new jobs and to ensure the economy grows, and thus to increase future taxes, because this will allow to pay employees who will pay taxes. So we believe that incomes should not be taxed. Only withdrawn capital, when businesses try to withdraw their capitals from the country, only in this case they should pay taxes on their incomes. I think that this also would allow to establish new relations with investors. As of today, we have no incentives to show our correct incomes in order to prevent any charges from fiscal service in the future. Because they act discretionally and try to force us to pay additional taxes all the time. And in case of our bill, since businesses would not need to pay income taxes, they would be able to show that they are successful, reliable businesses, and won't be afraid to show their real incomes. Would not fear the fiscal service. And thus we will be able to develop our businesses without excessive deductions to the state budget. This bill needs a strong advocacy. Without strong advocacy, this bill won't be passed. Unfortunately, by now, the reforms in Ukraine resemble Edison's first attempts to produce an electric lamp. He needed 2,000 attempts to produce a workable lamp. So we today in our reforming process acting similarly. We try to make 2,000 attempts unsuccessfully before we get any success. All the businessmen understand why our bill is so useful, because they know about the problem of corruption. They know that income tax and income and corporate income, these are quite different things in Ukrainian realities, and we clearly understand that reinvestment of corporate incomes would allow to ensure growth of businesses, growth of the economy, and result of multiplied investments and growth of businesses, we will be able to pay more taxes. So today we appeal to businesses, please support us in our advocacy campaign to approve the bill on withdrawn capital instead of corporate income tax. Good morning. I would like to describe in more detail what we want to apply in order to substitute one inefficient tax with another which will create incentives. We should, as a businessman, should unite our efforts. When we travel abroad, when we travel, for example, to Baltic countries, who used to be members of the same country that we were 25 years ago, we observe that they have perfect roads, which means that they have sufficient tax collections as revenues to the state budget. Unfortunately, in Ukraine, we do not have the force which is interested in right development of the country. I think the entrepreneurs, the businessmen could become such force. That's why I encourage businessmen to unite to come to understanding that the bill on a tax on withdrawn capital could become a real driver of the economy. I encourage you to visit our website, betterfuture.org.ua, review those businesses which already joined us. This is more than 200 different businesses join us, and after having reached sufficient number of participants, will be able to approach to the parliament, to the government, etc. I would like to add.
I'm not one of the authors of the draft law, but I was invited as a businessman, as an owner of some companies. It is important to know the opinion of the business. It is important to know that the situation which we have is very unique. The reforms are a word that is widely used now, but if we were celebrating the 25th years of independence, but to put it briefly, it's all about the words. People are talking a lot, but there are no real changes. There are no real reforms. And now business does not see what could happen in the nearest future. Either it's hiding somewhere, but basically the authorities are not doing anything realistically, and the task of the business is to help authorities to make effective steps. Now, what we have is people say that that could lead to the situation when the revenues to the budget will go down. Where will we find the compensators for the budget? But any businessman is controlling result. And the civil servants are to be responsible for the results. The result is such: our GDP went down twofold. We had 80 billion last year, and this year we will not have the GDP, which is more than 80 billion. And the GDP per capita is about $2,000, and that's the lowest in Europe, and our salaries are the lowest in Europe. For the investor to come to Ukraine, we have only one attractive feature, which is low salaries, and that is a dead end that turns the state into banana republic. We had a very powerful heavy industry, and for such a country it's a disaster, but the authorities will have to execute reforms, because otherwise there will be no result at all. There was a meeting with the Minister of Economy a couple of days ago, and everyone understands that 53% of the economy of Ukraine are in shadow, and that is what even up there is recognized. Our task is to do something to come to agreement with business, so that business comes out of the shadow, because now the processes are such are that in order to stay competitive, the companies have to minimize taxes. They have either to stay in shadow or go to shadow. The system is created in such a way when there are two systems of taxation, the general and simplified. There's a corruption component there. Many entrepreneurs are doing it not because they are bad, not because they don't like their country, but just because they cannot survive otherwise, and they cannot preserve themselves as a business. But that business has to come to agreement with business. There has not been any public agreement. All the socialistic principles when we first decide what we spend and then we'll think of how we will get this money from business, all that should go into the past. The public agreement means not just the tax reforms or some other or some items of that reform, but it means wider steps of the authorities, starting from how the money is spent, the money which is collected as tax. But without basically with some foundation we will fail to do it. The tax reform is a starting point for systemic reforms in our country. Why tax reform? Because companies, businesses, businessmen are tired of being the criminals in the existing system. Unfortunately, to stay afloat, most of the entrepreneurs have to try to go from away from taxes. The investors, when they see dual taxation, they don't want to invest into Ukraine, and the tax on exported capital will help to show the real situation, and without that we will not survive. Now there are more money coming out of the country than investments coming into country. There are many people who are leaving. That's economic immigration. This process is taking place in waves, and unfortunately I will not be able to give you any optimistic figures. This should be not in some faraway future, but if changes do not take place from the 1st January 2017, then I am afraid that the economic result in 2017 will be worse than in 2015 or 2016.
Слово запрошується пан Едуард Kurganskyi.
Доброго дня.
Kurganskyi. We entrepreneurs, we're now in a vicious circle. If you pay taxes, you become not competitive, and because some businesses avoid paying taxes, and almost all businesses in Ukraine avoid taxation. If you do not pay taxes, if you work in the shade, you lose your chance to protect your private property, because this way your private property is not legal, and so we have to do something. We need to change the tax system so that it is not connected to business. The tax system has to be neutral, and the first one is the profit tax. I mean, that is to be reformed. People get salaries in the envelopes. Otherwise, they will have to give away 42% to the state. So starting this campaign, we hope that we will change the tax system so that it will allow people not to hide their income. The entrepreneurs work with the innovations, and we are used to the situation that sometimes you cannot find some very simple solution. The solution is to be non-standard. In 1998, the single tax was introduced in Ukraine, and that has become a certain social innovation because in a year the revenues to the budget went up several times from small business, but the main thing is that the number of people who switched to a simplified system was big. Now we need to do the same with the general system of taxation. The system has to change so that business doesn't have to hide their revenues. And if we change the income tax, if we replace it by the tax on exported capital, that will change the situation. How to do it politically or socially? There's no party, no movement that would represent the interests of business. So we business are initiating this campaign. Maybe that's good. We have a certain objective, we understand it, and we will achieve our objective. Thank you, colleagues. Are there any questions or clarifications? If you have no questions or clarifications, this is the end. Thank you. See you again.